It's an ordinary evening. The kind where the world outside your window seems miles away, tucked behind the protective walls of your home. It's the time when the house feels quiet, almost too quiet, and the darkness that gathers outside only makes you feel more alone. For most, that's just the beginning of a peaceful night, but for others, it's when the horror begins. This is the story of Emily, a college student who thought she was going to spend her Friday evening like any other. The campus was quiet, her friends were all away for the weekend, and she had the entire place to herself. But what was supposed to be a quiet, peaceful night soon turned into a nightmare she would never forget. Emily had always been the type to embrace solitude. She loved her little apartment off campus, small but cozy, tucked in the heart of a quiet neighborhood. The evenings, especially, were a time for her to unwind, catch up on work, and binge-watch her favorite shows. That Friday, her plans were simple: take out some pizza, eat in front of the TV, and fall asleep to the sound of her favorite movies. But as she settled into her couch, the hum of her fridge the only sound in the room, she began to feel a sense of unease. She wasn't sure why. Maybe it was the silence, it felt different. The usual comforting quiet had morphed into something suffocating, as if the walls themselves were listening, waiting. Emily tried to shake it off, reaching for the remote and turning on a random show to distract herself. But the unsettling feeling only deepened. She paused the show, suddenly conscious of the faint sound, just outside the front door. Thump, thump, thump. Her heart skipped a beat. At first, she tried to convince herself it was just the old pipes. After all, the building was ancient, and the sounds it made were often strange, echoing through the walls. But no, this was different. This wasn't the normal creaks and groans she had grown accustomed to. Thump, thump, thump. The sound grew louder. Her breath caught in her throat. Who would be knocking at this hour? It was nearly midnight. Everyone she knew was either asleep or out of town. Hesitantly, she approached the door, her footsteps muffled against the carpet. She glanced through the peephole, but saw nothing. Only darkness. For a moment, Emily stood frozen, unsure of what to do. Then, against her better judgment, she opened the door. There was no one there. Confused and slightly relieved, Emily stepped outside onto the porch. The cool night air brushed against her skin, sending a shiver down her spine. She looked around, empty street. Nothing but the distant glow of streetlights illuminating the silent road ahead. What was that noise? She turned to go back inside, but as she did, she noticed something strange. The doormat, which she had just cleaned earlier that day, was now askew. She crouched down to straighten it, but when she did, her heart nearly stopped. There, on the ground beneath the mat, was something she had never seen before, a small piece of paper, folded neatly. No envelope. No address. Just the paper. With trembling hands, she picked it up and unfolded it. The message was simple but chilling: "I'm right behind you." Her stomach turned, nausea creeping up her throat. Panic surged through her. She spun around, half expecting someone to be standing there, just as the note implied. But there was no one. The street was empty, as it had been moments ago. Yet, the air felt different now. Tighter. Thicker. As if the world itself was holding its breath. Emily slammed the door shut, locking it immediately. She bolted the deadbolt and retreated to the living room. Her mind raced. Was this a joke? A prank from one of her friends? Or something far more sinister? She grabbed her phone, her fingers trembling as she scrolled through her contacts. But she didn't know who to call. Everyone was either asleep or too far away. She decided to try and shake it off, telling herself she was just overreacting. But then came the sound again. Thump, thump, thump. It wasn't outside anymore. It was inside the house. Emily stood frozen, the hairs on the back of her neck standing on end. The unmistakable sound of footsteps echoing from the hallway. It was as though someone was walking just behind her, but no one was there. She turned slowly, scanning the empty room, her pulse racing in her chest. The sound continued, closer now. She wasn't alone. And she had no idea who, or what, was making the noise. Emily's breathing became shallow as she backed away toward the kitchen. Her eyes darted around the room, searching for something, anything, to explain the footsteps. But the apartment was eerily still, with nothing but the faint hum of her fridge and the pounding of her heart in her ears. The thumping continued, growing louder, more deliberate. It was almost as if someone was following her every movement, matching her steps, getting closer and closer. She didn't know what to do. Should she call the police? No, it was probably just someone messing with her. But then again, who would do something like this? Why? Then, just as suddenly as the noise began, it stopped. The room fell silent, too silent. But something was off. A cold draft swept through the room, despite the windows being shut. Emily turned to the hallway, her pulse quickening. From the corner of her eye, she thought she saw a shadow move across the wall. It was quick, fleeting, so brief she wasn't sure if it was real or if her mind was playing tricks on her. But then came the whispers. Faint at first. Almost imperceptible. Emily. Her name. Her heart skipped a beat. She wasn't imagining it. Someone, or something, was in her home. The whispers grew louder, more distinct, as if the voice was coming from inside the walls themselves. Emily. She spun around, her eyes wide with fear, but again, nothing. She bolted for the front door, desperate to escape, but when she reached for the handle, she froze. The door was locked. She had just locked it moments ago. But now, it was ajar. Her breath hitched in her throat. She could feel the presence behind her, the suffocating weight of something malevolent hovering just out of sight. The whispers continued to echo in her mind, filling her head with dread. Then, as she stepped back, one of the walls creaked. The painting on the wall, one she had never paid much attention to before, was now crooked. It swayed slightly as if pushed by an invisible hand. Her eyes locked on it. She couldn't look away. It felt like the room was closing in on her. She was trapped. But just before she could react, a figure appeared in the doorway. Emily's entire body went cold with the terrifying realization. The shadowed figure was no longer just a strange presence in her home, it was something far more sinister. It was here because she had allowed it in. There was no escape now. The air around her seemed to thicken, the atmosphere becoming charged with a palpable, malevolent energy. Every breath she took felt heavy, suffocating, as if the very air was being drained from the room. The figure didn't move. It simply stood there, watching her with its dark, empty face. Its twisted limbs remained frozen in place, but the weight of its gaze felt like a physical force, pinning her to the wall. Emily's mind raced, her thoughts a blur of panic and confusion. What was this thing? What did it want with her? Why was it here? In her frantic state, she suddenly remembered the words she had read on the note earlier, "I'm right behind you." Was that the warning? Or had it been a taunt? Was it watching her even then? Her heart skipped a beat, the thought of being constantly observed by something that wasn't human sent a tremor through her body. She tried to call for help again, but the words caught in her throat. Her phone was in the other room, and the creature was between her and the only means of escape. It knew this. It was playing with her, like a cat toying with its prey. And then it moved. The figure stepped forward with a slow, deliberate motion, its limbs bending at unnatural angles as it approached. Its feet didn't make a sound on the floor. It didn't need to. The silence in the room had already become deafening. All Emily could hear was the sound of her own heartbeat, pounding in her ears. Her instincts screamed at her to run. But there was nowhere to go. Before she could react, the figure raised one of its clawed hands and extended it toward her. Its fingers were long, impossibly long, and as they reached out, Emily felt a cold breeze, like a gust of wind coming from the void that was the creature's body. The temperature in the room dropped drastically, and the breath she exhaled turned into mist. The hand hovered in front of her, and Emily instinctively shrank back. It was as though the thing wanted to touch her, to feel her, to claim her. But just as quickly as it had advanced, the hand stopped. It hovered, motionless, waiting. Emily's mind raced for any means of escape. She had no weapons. No way to defend herself. The only thing she could do was pray. Pray that it would leave her alone. But the figure didn't leave. Instead, it lowered its hand and pointed once again, this time to the living room behind her. "It's watching you." The voice, if it could be called a voice, was even more distorted now, like 100 voices overlapping each other. Emily's blood ran cold. What did it mean? She spun around, desperately looking for some sign of what it was talking about. Her eyes locked on the couch, and her heart froze in her chest. There, sitting calmly, was another figure, this one smaller, hunched over, its face hidden in shadow. The room's dim lighting made it almost impossible to see clearly, but Emily could feel the presence. It was real. And it was watching her. The figure on the couch didn't move. It didn't even breathe. It just sat there, staring at her with unseen eyes. The figure on the couch didn't move. Its hunched shape seemed to dissolve into the dim shadows, becoming one with the darkness that surrounded it. But Emily felt it, undeniably. Its gaze was fixed on her, burning through the stillness of the room, as though it were trying to pry into her very soul. She could feel her pulse pounding in her throat, each beat louder than the last. The world around her seemed to warp. The air felt heavier, the space in the room growing smaller and smaller with each passing second. The presence of the shadowy figure by the door still loomed, watching her, waiting. And now, the one on the couch had joined it, silent but ever so menacing. Emily's mind was spiraling, barely able to keep up with what was happening. She had no idea how to react, no idea what she was supposed to do. Her thoughts were clouded with panic. The note. The figure. The whispers. It was all connected, wasn't it? The voice that had spoken moments ago, it's watching you, echoed in her mind like a constant, maddening chant. She could no longer distinguish where the whispers were coming from. They were inside her head, now, growing louder with every breath she took. "You're not alone. I'm right behind you." Emily shook her head, trying to clear the oppressive fog. But no matter how much she willed it, she couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. And then, as if her very thoughts had summoned it, the figure on the couch shifted. A slow, deliberate movement, like a predator waking from its slumber. Emily's heart skipped a beat as she backed away, her breath coming in short gasps. She was cornered, her back pressed against the wall, trapped between the living nightmare in front of her and the one still standing in the doorway. The figure on the couch slowly rose to its feet. It was smaller than the one in the doorway. Its proportions seemed almost human at first glance, but something about its movements made it unmistakably wrong. It was like watching something try to mimic a human body but failing. Its limbs were too long, too thin, with joints that bent in unnatural directions. The edges of its body flickered, as though the figure couldn't fully manifest in the material world. It was the look in its eyes, if they could even be called eyes, that terrified Emily the most. Dark, bottomless pits where there should have been pupils. There was nothing human about them. It wasn't even alive, she realized. Not in the way she understood life. It was an echo, a shadow of something that should never have existed in this world. And it was staring at her. A guttural, low growl rumbled from the creature's throat, an unsettling sound that didn't seem to belong to anything natural. It was a sound that resonated deep within Emily's chest, vibrating her very bones. Her limbs trembled, and she could barely hold her ground. But then, the voice returned. "It's you. You're the key." The words rang in her ears, over and over again. You're the key. The air felt suffocating, pressing down on her from all sides, as though the very walls were closing in. The weight of the words hung in the air like a thick fog, and the realization slowly began to creep in: she wasn't just an observer in this nightmare. She was part of it. Something about her presence, something about the fact that she had opened the door, had allowed this to happen. She had invited it in, yes, but it wasn't just that. There was something deeper, something older at play here. The figures weren't just haunting her, they were tied to her. And the more she thought about it, the more the pieces started to fall into place. She was part of the story. Everything Emily thought she knew about the world began to unravel as she stood there, trapped in the horror of her own home. The creatures, if they could be called creatures, were not just figments of her imagination. They were real. And they weren't done with her yet. You're the key. Those words repeated in her mind like a chant, and they seemed to be pulling at something deep within her. What did it mean? What did they want from her? It wasn't just the apartment. It wasn't just the door she had opened. This went far beyond that. They were here for something, and somehow, Emily had become entwined in their dark purpose. The shadowy figure in the doorway took a step forward, its movement slow, deliberate. It tilted its head to one side, and the silence in the room became unbearable. The figure on the couch followed suit, rising from its spot and standing motionless, both of them now closing in on her from either side. Emily felt her body tense, her throat tightening. She didn't have much time left. She had to do something. But what? Her mind raced through every horror movie she'd ever seen, every survival tactic she'd ever learned. Nothing seemed to make sense. Nothing could prepare her for this. As if sensing her rising panic, the dark figure in the doorway spoke again. Make the choice. The voice was chilling, sending waves of dread over Emily. Make the choice? What choice? Then, the other figure, the one from the couch, moved closer, its fingers stretching toward her. It's time. A surge of terror flooded her senses, and Emily snapped. Her legs moved before her mind could catch up. She ran. Without thinking, without knowing why, she turned toward the hallway and dashed for the kitchen. But as she reached the doorframe, she froze. There, standing at the far end of the hallway, was another figure, a third, even more grotesque than the first two. It was draped in shadows, its body contorted in impossible angles, its head hanging loosely, as if it were broken. And it was looking at her. The world around Emily seemed to fade away. The room spun as she realized the truth: she wasn't just being haunted. She had become the target. The key. This was no coincidence. The presence in her home wasn't something random, it was part of something far bigger, far older than she could comprehend. Make the choice. There was no escape. She was trapped, with no way out. And then, everything went dark.